As a boy, he constructed a crude raft with which to explore the creek that flowed through a neighbor's farm. Canoes, kayaks, and outboards followed, but his fantasy of sailing to far-off places on his own sailboat lay dormant for much of his life. Finally, as a middle-aged father, he found the determination to learn to sail, to navigate, and to effectively pursue his dream. Within a few years, he acquired the boat of his dreams and found himself 2 days out on the Gulf of Maine, fighting a torn mainsail at night while a gale raged around him. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Forsyth.
Woo-hoo. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to In Pursuit of a Dream. I'd like to tell you a little about my presentation before I begin. First, I have no notable sailing skills to pass along to you, so you needn't worry about taking copious notes. Second, you don't have to have any sailing experience whatsoever. All you really need is a dream. In fact, it's the dreamers who will benefit most from what I have to say today. I'm going to talk about how I transitioned from landlubber to cruiser. And it's my hope that by sharing my story, you might be inspired to make your dream come true. I'll invite questions at the end of the first segment and again at the conclusion of the presentation. And I'll be providing my contact information so you can reach me at any time thereafter. By show of hands, how many of you have a boat of some sort? Okay, that's a good start. Now, regardless of whether you have a boat suitable for cruising, who here has dreamed of sailing away without having to return to work in a week or two? Should be everybody. Okay, let's talk about turning dreams into reality. Ever since I was a teenager, I dreamed of sailing to exotic ports on my own boat. It was a romantic notion based on my love of Robert Ballantyne's book, The Coral Island. As you might expect, Ballantyne's story was about coconut palms, parrots, sandy beaches, and tropical trade winds. Ultimately, I failed to reach the tropics due to a key crew member's family emergency. Still, I put more than 6,000 nautical miles of wake behind me. And while my dream was never fully attained, those were the most memorable years of my life. Like most people, I left school, got a job, married, and acquired a 30-year mortgage. And for years, I didn't do one thing to make my dream come true. Then, more than 20 years into my career, I attended a Jack Canfield seminar. Now, Jack Canfield was a brilliant motivational speaker, and that day his topic was achieving goals. I was still struggling to provide for 3 children at the time, but I was inspired, so I followed Canfield's advice. Begin, he said, by taking little steps toward your dream. Make a list of all the things you can do to help you reach your objective. I started my list with read about the sailing adventures of others. I reasoned that that would keep me focused while I was learning about sailing. At Canfield's suggestion, I wrote positive affirmations on Post-it notes and stuck them up in the bathroom mirror. Perhaps I should point out that I wasn't so much in love with sailing as I was with the notion of exploring. Sailing would simply provide me with the opportunity to explore at what I thought would be a reasonable cost. After all, the wind is free, right? I couldn't afford to buy a boat at the time, so I walked to a nearby bank on my lunch hour and opened a special savings account. It became known within the family as the boat account, and it grew slowly at first, but I kept finding new ways to save. Every time I was tempted to spend money on something, I'd ask myself, do I want this more than I want a sailboat? And most often the answer was no, so the money went directly into the boat account. It took 10 years to acquire the funds for the right boat, but those years gave me the time to learn what I needed to know about cruising, and I had a lot to learn. So early on, I enrolled in the local sailing club's 30-hour basic keelboat course. I read everything I could find about sailing and sailboats, and I kept adding to my list of little things that I could do to reach my goal. The day I passed the basic keelboat course, I approached an aging sailor in a Hamilton boatyard. He'd been a ship's carpenter, a veteran of Britain's Blue Funnel Line. More recently, he had been employed by the Canadian Hydrographic Service, updating charts of inland waters. And though he'd spent years at sea aboard freighters and on powerboats in the Great Lakes, he knew little about sails or sailing. Still, he knew lots about boats and seamanship. He was standing on a ladder, sanding the mahogany tow rail of his aging 30-foot Oldberg when I first saw him. A for sale sign hung from the little sloop's cradle. The old salt complained that he was getting too old to manage the boat by himself, so I offered to crew for him in exchange for the experience, and he accepted. He was abrasive. He was impatient. He was demanding as hell. But he taught me a lot about seamanship, whether he meant to or not. For example, during the second season that I crewed for him, one particularly windy morning, we had just cleared the lift bridge between Hamilton Harbor and Lake Ontario in the company of a powerboat and a similarly sized sloop, when we encountered unusually large westbound swells. Both of the other vessels turned around within the canal and retreated to the harbor. With gallons of spray exploding off the bow, the old sailor yelled through the wind, "If you don't go out in this, lad, you'll never sail the Atlantic." Now, I never forgot that moment because he was right. Once out on the lake with the sails up and the auxiliary shut down, the boat steadied herself against the wind. No longer was she driven forcefully into the waves by a madly spinning propeller, but rather she rose up and rode over them like a seabird. If we'd retreated to the harbor like the others, I never would have known how comfortable the little vessel was with heavy weather. The following year, I enrolled in a one-week live-aboard cruising course in Georgian Bay. And when the instructor asked for a volunteer to go up the mast, I remembered that experience in the canal. Someday I would have to go up my own mast. So in spite of my fear of heights, I volunteered. I was nervous, but it wasn't as scary as I had expected. And I had taken another little step toward my dream. Later, when I crewed on other boats, I found many skippers were unwilling, or at least reluctant, to go up a mast. So I generally became the designated mast monkey. My reward was a privileged view, unique to the masthead, and the respect of other crew members. But more importantly, I knew that if I went cruising on my own boat, I'd be able to replace a masthead light or clear a jammed halyard if necessary. To practice what I had learned in the classroom, I rented 24-foot sharks from the local sailing club, 3 hours at a time. I hung out in marinas and talked to sailors about their boats. I passed a coastal navigation course and got my VHF operator certificate. I signed up to learn the then new technology, GPS. All the while, my library of books kept growing. When I joined the World Cruising Club, I listened intently to their featured speakers and asked lots of questions. I spent days walking around boat shows. I even drove to the show in Annapolis, Maryland one year. The internet was still in its infancy at the time, so my search for the ideal vessel was not a digital one. I regularly bought a yellow-covered newsprint magazine called Boats for Sale and searched it for sailboats that met my requirements. In the beginning, my idea of the appropriate boat was rather vague. Over time, I assembled a short list of features important to me. And though countless smaller vessels had successfully crossed the North Atlantic, I decided 30 feet was the ideal length for my skill level. Having once experienced an onboard fire in the middle of Lake Ontario, I opted for a diesel auxiliary. I just didn't want to have gasoline on board. I decided a full keel would be better at holding a course over long distances. And I read somewhere that a high ballast ratio would add stability in extreme weather. In my view, 4 berths, a galley, a head, and a nav station were all essential. And I wanted a boat with a wheel rather than a tiller. Though honestly, I just thought it looked cooler. And I had a rather limiting budget. My wife and I drove hundreds of miles to look at dozens of boats, eliminating one after the other on the basis of their requirements, or more often based on the seller's asking price. Eventually, I found a 15-year-old 29 Allberg in Georgian Bay and closed the deal. From that point onward, everything else in my life was neglected. My wife and I spent our weekends cleaning, repairing, and decorating our little blue water sloop. Most of our discretionary spending went to maintenance, equipment, and modifications. When the travel lift hoisted her out of the cradle for the first time, the stress was unbearable. I just spent slightly less than a year's income on a 7-ton boat, and she was dangling in a sling 8 feet off the ground. When she was lowered into the water, I scurried aboard to check for leaks. Then we rigged her 42-foot mast for the first time and stepped it with a hand-operated crane. I felt incompetent as I maneuvered her through the marina to our assigned slip. The first season, we sailed no further than 10 miles from the dock. Yet with a draft of only 4.5 feet, I managed to find a rock 4 feet beneath the surface. A slow leak forced us to haul the boat a couple of weeks earlier. I repaired the damage, and by the second season, we began cautiously exploring the more distant islands and channels. My dream of sailing away to foreign ports was getting closer. Alice Rose was the perfect boat, but she still lacked a lot of very expensive cruising essentials. And I was far from being ready to take on an ocean. We sailed Georgian Bay for 5 years, building confidence one weekend at a time. We spent every day of my annual leave and every extra dollar on the boat. Okay, let's talk about how cruising might fit into your life. Here are 4 broad approaches to cruising. It's up to you and those close to you to decide what might work. 1, the Nike approach. Perhaps you're single and unattached. Put together a nest egg and just do it. 2, the calendar approach. Cruise when you can. Annual leave, leave of absence, between employment contracts, and leave the boat at ports along the way until you can return. It's an ideal approach for those employed in seasonal work or in education. 3, the committed approach. Sell everything, buy a boat, and homeschool the kids. It wasn't for me, but some families have made cruising a lifestyle. 4, the deferred approach. Save, plan, organize, and defer extended cruising until you've retired, as I did. Those are the basics of reaching your goal. Remember, keep taking little steps toward your dream, even when the reality seems too far off to be attainable.